So I think we will open floor for our audience to ask questions or share their thoughts. Like I'll just take the advantage. So Giovanna, what you described, what the Italian community faced in the 1950s and 60s was almost exactly what the Chinese community, Chinese Canadians are facing today. So look different, economically relatively disadvantaged, and their country of origin probably in that list of enemy. So I just wonder, like, how do you think the Italian community come out of that?
Oh, what a great, fine question. Well, you know, I worked for 15 years in Chinatown as a teacher, so I'm very familiar with the Chinese community and the culture. How did the Italian, I would invite Francesco and Antonia to pipe in whenever they want, or anyone else that would like to answer. One of my observations was just how hardworking the Italians were. As I said, both my mother and my sister went into the factory right away. My father was working, and it was all to be able to get this house and to come up out of poverty and be able to have some kind of security. So what John Porter recognized from his research was that the crucial element for class mobility was education, and of course that first generation of Italians didn't have the privilege of being educated, and some of us did. The children of the first generation children that came along. But the factors he identified as well that kept families from social mobility and from educating their children were three. One was the lack of education on the part of the parents, low income in terms of family income, and I'm trying to remember the third one. Large families, and all three of which the Italians had. And so in that first generation, I think you had some children that crossed over, got an education, and were able to then move up. But the hardworking factor and the idea that the Italians really wanted to rise out of poverty, I think was crucial. My brother, for instance, as I said, dropped out of school in grade 9, but decided he wanted to be rich. I decided I wanted to be smart. Both of us succeeded, but he built himself a big house on Mississauga. He runs around with wealthy people. Bidding for contracts, gets invited to big social clubs that Canadians belong to, et cetera, et cetera. So he rose up through financial success, which I think was prominent in the Italian community. And I think the rest of us through the generations got our education. I will say that the representation of Italians by the 1980s in the professional classes was, as I said before, equal to the rest of the Canadian population. But in my opinion, those, just thinking off the top here, those are two things that I would pinpoint. One was financial success and independence, financial independence, as well as the generations moving up into education, getting post-secondary education and moving into the professions and into political places. Does that help you?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Um,
I'd like to say something about what Giovanna just said.
Pardon me?
Who's speaking?
Yeah, who is speaking?
Oh, go ahead. Hi, Francesco.
Oh, no, I just wanted to say that I agree with Giovanna. One thing that I would point out is that even in that first generation, which is a generation that for me is still includes the most canonical writers of Canadian, Italian-Canadian literature. I think when you think of Piazzas di Cicco, Mary Di Michele, Mary Melfi, Frank Paci, you've got quite a bit of the core, even though there are lots of other writers, including Carmelo, of course, that whose work I admire very much. But one thing that I wanted to say is that when these writers go back, when these writers write, they do go back to the parents. They, of course, find that what they left behind would have made them wordless if they remained there. But they do go back. I think what I would want to emphasize is what we owe to that generation. What we owe to that generation by that silent work, by that tacit, non-obstreperous presence is precisely what we now can make us feel that we're no longer. This is what I meant about Antonia's work. In a sense, if we can write about food, for example, with that very marvelous way she does, it's primarily because of the work of those people who couldn't have said those words. And I think it is important. There, quite apart from that, there is one writer, who, Carmen Esternino, who actually proposes that the way to write is to go to those people who write in that language, which is not writable language. I think there's a poem of his, I think, entitled "The Language of Cafone," if I'm not mistaken, in which he says, "I want to write like those roof fixers from Bari or Puglia that I heard, swearing, doing all sorts of, saying all sorts of maybe even silly things, but that's the kind of work that the kind of likes that I would like to write." We're now back to where we do not only see the parents as silent, but see them as speaking in a way in which maybe we can also, from which we can also maybe learn for our trade.
And what I would add to that, on that theme of silence, is that I think part of what feeds the silence is that they felt that their own experience wasn't valid, wasn't important enough to be recorded or discussed in a literary way or even in a historical way. I remember interviewing my uncle about his experiences, and he simply said to me, "Why do you ask me these questions? This is something nobody cares about, and I don't even care about it anymore." So there was this, and that's why I said earlier, the culture itself, Southern Italian culture, encouraged silence in the sense that they were told by the elites of their own country that their experience was irrelevant. And I think that they brought that view to Canada. And of course, as writers, we try to, it's almost like an archaeological dig. You have to go back and find out what that experience is and actually say, that was wrong. That, in fact, that experience, the simple act of drawing water out of a well, that's beautiful. And that's a great image. And that is not irrelevant. That is part of who we are. And it's not, there's this and I also think it comes from a generalized thing that happens in literature, this notion between high culture and low culture that, some experiences are worth putting pen to paper and some experiences in the past anyway, have been classified as mundane and not relevant at all. Although I think we've moved away from that. But I mean, I was part of that generation where you know, you went to university and you read the greats. You didn't read them, you know, and the greats talked about big ideas and big thoughts. They didn't talk about walking down a road with sheep in front of you with the sun out. You know, although maybe somebody did, some minor Scottish poet, perhaps, I don't know. but again, the silence comes out of, I think, not only a lack of language, but a lack of recognition that experience was the experience of rural Italians, both in Italy on the farm and in the cities, was valid. That's it. That's all I want to say.
Right.
Carmelo, I wanted to add, oh, if I could, I wanted to add something about identity. Recently, doing an interview for a creative writing class at a local university, I was asked, do you think you would have become a writer had you stayed in Italy? I was 3 when we immigrated, and you know, going through the whole identity thing with language, not knowing a word of English when I started kindergarten, and how that basically is a very you know, memorable time in my life, and how that probably you know, encouraged me to learn the English language. And processing my journey in learning language and dealing with dual identities, I wrote a piece called Product of Italy, Made in Canada. And when I was asked that question, do you think that you would have gone the same route, you know, in Italy? I really couldn't answer it, because everything that I experienced in this country led me to where I am. And really, my search for my Italian identity led me to research my history, and then basically enter into a metaphorical journey into my past, which then developed into a historical novel set in my you know, country, my terra materna, you know.
A wonderful,
so,
a wonderful literature, a wonderful piece of literature.
So I just, you know, it makes me think, like, what would have happened had we stayed? But my family, like many, left because of economic hardship. And so it's just something that, you know, just makes me wonder. And again, you know, honoring the my parents who didn't have, you know, who didn't finish their education and who tried to do the best they could. I wanted to honor them and their sacrifices in writing.
Could I respond to that?
I just wonder if we could have, there's a question from Jonna here, and I think Francesco, I wonder if you could maybe address it. This is for writers here, but Jonna says, can we please discuss why Italian Canadian writers are not considered Canadian writers? Like I think what she means is that they're still at the margins of literature rather than considered the center. The center, I don't know if you agree with this or not, whether you think the center of Canadian literature is still basically reserved for Anglo-Saxon or that type of writer.
I can clear that up if you want. Can you hear me?
Please do, John. Yeah, thank you, John.
I'm going to just simply say this. As a writer, you're ignored, period.
Of course you are.
Like,
I know that.
You know,
John, make your point.
I think this whole thing about being an Anglo versus Italian.
No. Stop, Carmela. That's not true. We've been doing it for a long time.
It's a silly conversation.
No. You know what?
You're a writer, you don't know this.
Invisibility is bloody exhausting. It's
Donna,
really.
Donna, wait a minute.
It's got nothing to do with being Italian.
That's not fair. That is not fair. Everybody has their individual experience and can translate it as they will, right?
Absolutely.
You had one experience in Winnipeg. I had a different one in Spadina and Davenport. Jonna had a different one where she was growing up.
Yeah, but that's not the question. The question is, why are supposedly Italian Canadians marginalized?
No, I'm not. No, actually, let me explain my question. Okay.
As a writer,
I would like to know why our literature is not in any way credited or as visible in Canadian literature markets, in the Canadian literature world. Why are our stories not as important as other immigrant stories or as other ethnic stories, or because we sort of missed the boat. In the 60s, nobody was interested. And now at this period, there are so many other stories to be told by other people who are living this immigrant experience. And we have made some sort of success in our communities. Therefore, it's like, you know, what are you whining about? You know, I mean, it's not important. My publisher told me in Italy, they're interested in Canadian literature. We are not even considered literary people because they're not interested in what our experience has been, what our stories have been. We can talk about all kinds of things that go into our stories, our poetry, whatever. I would just like one day to stop this invisibility, because as De Chico said, it is exhausting. I am not even there. This invisibility is exhausting. After 4 decades
can I say something?
Producing literature. That's all. That's what I meant.
Can I say something here? I think what we need is actually a good criticism that is interested in Italian Canadian literature. How many people write, even within the Italian Canadian community? Exactly. Very, very few. No, I agree with you that, I mean, after all, being famous is neither here nor there. Although I agree also with Giovanna, I think it's been several decades now. I think the only thing one must believe in is in doing good stuff, and maybe if you do enough good stuff, something will filter through. On the other hand, you know, people like Rimbaud, Verlaine, how many people read them? How many people read them in during their times? I mean, there was that kind of idea of the Cénacle. You write for your other 20 friends. You maybe publish your poems with a limited edition of 50. You know.
You know what? I've had this conversation, and I'm not trying to. I know I sound disrespectful. Excuse me if I have, but I've had this conversation before.
You're being a passionate Italian, Carmelo.
I am. Thank you. But I'll make it very quick because I don't want to take up everybody else's time. I had a friend of mine, and he said to me, "You should expect to be ignored."
Yeah.
When you write,
that's
not
true
expect
too.
to be recognized, and I think that's true.
So
the expectation that somehow, simply because you've published a book and it's out there, that somehow you're going to become, you know, the next Mick Jagger of the literary world is silly. That's all I got.
Why are you assuming that that's what I'm saying? Yeah, I'm not saying that at all. I've written 12 books. I don't want to be Mick Jagger. I don't want to be Margaret Atwood, but I want my voice to mean something, and I want it to be visible, not to be excluded the way it is excluded with many of us in the larger literary Canadian market. That is all I'm saying. I don't want to be anybody's rock star. Yeah. I write from a personal place, because for me, writing is an act of survival. It's not an act of being narcissistic, successful, or being a rock star. That's not who I am. But the work, if it has merit, it should also have the respect in this country that we have contributed to with our art, with our talents, with our strengths, to be part of the dialogue. That's all, Carmelo. I don't want to be a rock star.
All right.
I agree. I agree in one sense that well, I think it's a misinterpretation of what Jana is saying. And she is, I think, correct in some ways. In another sense, I think the writers in Canada that get recognition are really real recognition and become part of the canon, so to speak, are very few. The same people, I mean, anytime Miriam Taves publishes a book, she's up for the Giller. You know, anytime that Andre Alexis publishes a book, he's up for the Giller. And, you know, there was an essay written by Shane Nielsen, a poet, who talks about how the award scene is just this little group of people that circulate among each other, and how so much of the best poetry is actually ignored by the awards. And
if I can say this, Jana, only the best are ignored.
Thank you.
Yeah,
anyway, I think, you know, speaking for myself, I don't feel I get, I mean, I like most writers, Carmen Starnino himself, who probably is one of the better known Italian Canadian poets, himself said in an email, said his little red verses, how he feels ignored. And his books that get little attention, and his little red verses read by very few. So maybe this is just part of, unless you're one of the big names, it's just.
I think again, I don't want to belabor the point, but sure, I'd love a public. Am I sad that I don't have a public? No, but I'd like a public. But you know what? Yeah. That's not why I write. I'd like to have one. And this.
I think one would like to believe that you're right, and when you finish writing, it's like that message in a bottle that you leave out to the sea, right?
Yes.
But yeah, on the other hand, too, you'd like that bottle to not be lost in the waves. Yeah, I can feel that. I don't have that problem, of course, because nobody reads it off from the start.
I hope that bottle reaches people like Antonia Facciponte, which I'm sure it will. And that's the generation that's going to make some footsteps for us and for, you know, to give us some validity in the future.
I've been ignored for 20 years. I mean, so I'm not, you know, I just do what I got to do. And
we'll say, join the club.
What we need are more critics who write about Italian Canadian literature, even within our community. I think that is actually one of the key problems here. Not that I know of. It's not that as if we have all sorts of people writing in journals, in newspapers, from the Italian Canadian community about Italian Canadian writers, but without that criticism, even if it's an in-house, in-group kind of comment, I think that's the problem in one sense.
Yeah.
Well, we can't do it all, you know. I mean, we do the work. We can also do the criticism. That's up to you guys. You're the ones in the university.
How many are there who write about Italian Canadian literature? I mean, I think for a while it was just me and Pivato, for crying out loud.
That's right, exactly.
That's right.
Why? Because the universities aren't bothered with us, you know. That's
okay.
You know, my father once said to me, "You want to be a writer? You know, you're going to be poor the rest of your life. Italians don't read."
That's what they told
and the rest of the world doesn't care. He was right.
Okay, all right. I think Yang.
Yes.
Great. Thank you,
yes.
Donna, so much for getting all that Italian part of
yeah. Well, that's interesting discussion, but I'd like to ask our audience, are there any other questions for our guest speakers today?
Yeah, I'm just conscious of the time. Yes, it's 9 o'clock right now.
Okay. Yeah, so if
question.
That's another Italian-Canadian thing. They talk a lot.
And I do have a question for Antonia. So you struggled, or you have come a long way trying to keep that equilibrium. So at the third generation, why do you think it is important? Isn't it just easy to be like a Canadian, well, with some Italian background? And what would you say to other kids, like the third generation of, other immigrants? What would you recommend to them? What's the good approach to keep that equilibrium?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'll try to be really brief because it is 9 o'clock. But I think for me, I'm one of those people that really thinks about how to know who you are and to know where you're going, you have to know where you came from, in a sense. And you have to find that balance between, respecting that background and also moving forward and being able to, have your own critical approaches to things and thoughts. And I guess in terms of, trying to find an equilibrium between the two, it was very naturalized for me when I was a child. I was just Italian and Canadian. Italian was the background and Canadian was, the foreground. But I guess over the years, they've become more intertwined and much more difficult to see where one ends and the other begins. And, I never actually referred to myself as Italian Canadian until someone else said to me, oh, you're Italian Canadian. I thought, oh, I didn't know this was a thing where we hyphenate the two titles together. So just learning how to see them connect. And I don't know, I feel like I'm always still learning about new connections between the two and tensions between the two.
Can I ask you something?
Thank you.
Were there any books in your house?
There were lots of books in my house, but actual, lots of literary books, and they didn't really have kind of a genre or something. My parents just like collecting everything from, over time. So I definitely grew up in a household where there was a lot of stories around me, and my parents read to me a lot when I was a child, and took me to things like art galleries quite frequently. So I definitely had instilled in me from a very young age an appreciation. Sorry?
Would you say that's common among your Italian friends in Woodbridge or Downsview? Or?
These days, I don't know how many Italian friends I have. I feel like a lot of my Italian friends were from elementary school, and I don't really talk with them anymore. Yeah, relatives. Yeah, I think definitely in my parents' generation, there's a lot of interest in things like reading and collecting books and looking at art and things like that. But I also see that it's just dependent upon, the person's personality too. I don't want to generalize and say, every single sibling of my parents enjoys, collecting a ton of books or anything like that, simply because it's just dependent on who they are.
Can I say something there? The Italian-American writer Helen Barolini wrote a wonderful essay as an introduction to one of her anthologies. And one of the points she made was that publishers in the US didn't want to publish Italian-American writers because, as he put it, Italians don't buy books and they don't read. And I think only knows gesturing towards the fact that a lot of Italian kids, especially maybe second generation, grew up without any books in their houses. For instance, my sister, there are no books there except my books, right? Books that I have bought them, like photography books. And my brother wanted to have a set of the classics that he ordered just for display, but he never put them up, even when he got them. So I think that this is part of what Olino is addressing, is that maybe a certain generation, our parents' generation, and maybe to some extent the children, maybe did not feel very comfortable and revere literature as something to have around them.
Joanna, one thing that I would say, one thing that I would add is that generation go in cycle with migrants. You have first, second, third. After that, you sort of fade into the place in which you're in. But one thing is that migrants continue to come, not so much to Canada, but Italians go to Germany, England, within the European Union. Now, when they come to Canada, if those people learn, for example, English enough to begin to write, they will write from another perspective, but they will write. So there will be, again, another Italian-Canadian kind of writing. If we look at the last 40 to 50 years, there are still some first generation that, and for me, first generations are those who came with their parents. Then there are second generation, those born here. But once you get to Antonia, for example, and later on, it's difficult to think of them really Italian Canadian. The emphasis is on the Canadian more than on the Italian. So hopefully, with minority groups, if the cycle can begin again with other migrants, who knows? There will be a different dynamics and different ways of doing things. But I wouldn't say that Italian Canadians are going to disappear. Much depends if people are interested to come here, and that may be iffy.
Well, not only that, I would say that the kind of immigrant that comes now is very different from the 1950s and 60s.
Sure.
In 1967, the Canadian government instituted the point system.
Yeah.
You could no longer do sponsor your brother and whatever, just
right.
Cheap labor. You actually had to meet, certain criteria to have enough points to immigrate. And so I don't think the same kind of immigrant that follows that. Refugees, on the other hand, might be more of a mix.
Italians are more middle class, those that come here.
That's right. That's right. They have to be educated. They have to have some money to get their points, know a bit of English, etc. So I think we should wrap it up now.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing
Thank you, John.
your true stories and thoughts. Yeah.
Donna, don't be mad at me.
We're not mad at you, Carmelo. You're so passionate.
And Francesco, nice seeing you again. Thank you.
I think it's the first time actually that we saw each other.
And I must say, speaking of appreciation, I've always thought many years ago your kind attention was what can I say? It was great. Thank you.
Okay.
Right.
Dialogue is important.
What a great mind.
Things are important. Talking.
You know what? Next time I'm in Toronto, Joanna, we must have coffee or lunch.
Can I come?
He's in Ottawa.
Lunch.
Okay, Darlene, you could be the secretary.
Coffee with me and John.
Oh, very.
Anytime. I'm here.
Okay. Well, I have my daughter. My daughter's.
Everybody. Good night.
Goodbye.
Yeah, good session.
It was very nice.
Molto grazie.
All right.
Molto grazie.
Everybody.
Great session. Thank you.
Yay.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much.